Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So here we are with the first ever Sikh PA Show, just a platform for us to give our followers a chance to see the voices behind the Sikh PA and give us an opportunity to talk a bit more about some of the topics that we cover. And we are starting in a week where we have had some really big news stories. So we've got a lot to discuss, Devendra Pal Singh.
Absolutely. So we're starting off with the Kisan Rally, huge news at the moment, following the introduction of the 3 bills from the Indian government that affect agriculture, affect the farmers of Punjab particularly. And this is a story that we started covering in September this year, when the first round of protests began. And these 3 bills, the farmers are saying that they effectively seek to enslave them. So one of the kind of points about this is the minimum prices that were being guaranteed to farmers are now being revoked. So there's no more guaranteed prices, and this opens up the potential for anti-competitive behavior from monopoly organizations.
So I mean, firstly, one of the reasons that we're covering this, just for anyone wondering, because this isn't specifically a Sikh issue. It's an issue that affects all farmers, so there's people of all backgrounds and all statuses across India, and they are very much involved in the protest. But this, by its very nature, impacts the Sikh community greatly, because farming, agriculture is something which is kind of entwined within the Sikh society and the motherland of Punjab, the motherland of Sikhi. So it's something that's very important for us to cover. And from our perspective as reporters, as journalists, when you see a mass mobilization, I think the last kind of estimates were 12 million protesters are currently out there in the streets of India on their way to Delhi or protesting somewhere in some kind. It's something that we have to cover. And the farmers are saying that these laws are going to leave them open to exploitation. And therefore, that's something that we definitely need to cover and need to ensure that kind of we put out the message that these farmers, what they see is a very real path towards basically their bankruptcy and their lands being taken away. And that is kind of a huge issue that could leave Sikhs Sikh farmers in a state which is, just you can't even imagine it. And obviously they already had many issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's a human rights issue. We all know about the suicide rate amongst farmers. For several years now, there's been hundreds of farmers every year committing suicide because of laws and regulation that has been introduced by the government. A lot of this has been GM crops, like GM companies such as Monsanto, providing seeds which overpromised and underdelivered. They promised to generate huge yields with very kind of hardy crops that will, survive throughout difficult temperatures and different terrains. But in reality, actually, what it's ended up doing is destroying a lot of crops and also causing illnesses like cancer. Monsanto, we've mentioned, in California, they've been forced to pay out $10.9 billion because of their products, their pesticides especially, causing cancer. And this is what's been going on in Punjab for several years now. It's very much it's another human rights violation of Sikhs in Punjab, to add to the many that we already report on. And we can even see from the image as well that human rights violations extended to, violence, a man in riot gear beating elderly farmers. These are 70, 80-year-old men. And it's, it's frankly quite disgusting. And it has no place in a modern society, especially a country even that calls itself the largest democracy in the world.
So hopefully all of our followers can see that, as an organization which works for the Sikh Panth, this is something that we have had to cover. And again, it's just to kind of reiterate on some of those points. It's the protests that we're seeing currently taking place are very much a culmination of various issues that have now come to a head with these new laws that have been implemented. I think they were first pushed through in March and they were ratified in September. And now, the farmers are kind of in a state where this is life or death for them. So that's why they've taken to the streets en masse. And as we saw in the image previous, they've faced just violence. And that's with no surprise, sadly, when it comes to dealing with the Indian state, they face great violence. They've been beaten by police. They've faced tear gas. They've faced water cannons. But yet they've kind of marched through all of this with that typical Sikh chardi kala attitude to go and, do what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, and the threat to their livelihoods is very real. There's these huge organizations, these monopolies, they stand to really hold the farmers to ransom for their crops, because they've got huge cold storage facilities where they can hoard their crops and they can just hold on to them until the farmers' crops are, coming to their expiry date, their use by date, and then, force the farmers to lower their prices or even just not buy them and just let those crops die, and those farmers then go bankrupt. And then when they're bankrupt, then they haven't got any power to be able to hold on to their land. They'll just have their land seized. And the end game that I think the farmers and the rest of the Sikh community is concerned about is this being some sort of corporate stroke government takeover of land, from the Sikhs, from the Punjabis essentially, and from the farmers to the state.
And again, there is kind of a pattern here that we've seen internationally in other countries like the USA, for example, where there have been similar kind of moves made, and essentially that has ended the to a large extent anyway, the life of the little farmer, the individual that kind of just survives off their own land without any need for kind of connection with the corporations. And looking at this image that we have here now, I think it'd be a good point to talk about the way the media have covered this. And firstly, regarding this image, what we've heard a lot about the protests is that they are violent. Even in the West, I've seen articles by The Independent, by the New York Times, calling the farmers, the protesters, angry. And from my perspective, a lot of the kind of imagery that is being painted here is to portray them as a mob that are, just out for, I guess, power or, whatever meets their agenda. Whereas in reality, what we're seeing is, again, farmers that are really desperately fighting for their livelihood. But as they're doing it, we're seeing them in typical Sikh fashion also live up to Sikh principles.
Yeah, I mean, the Saki of Bikanerji being, inspiration for this as well. That image reminds me of that. Is many of us will be familiar with the Saki of Bikanerji, who was a Sikh at the time of Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj, who would serve water and tend to the enemy soldiers that had fallen as well. It's a similar principle. There's no hate amongst Sikh. In a Gurmat mindset, we don't have hate. We just have this intolerance for injustice, and that's essentially what it is. An injustice, an injustice that's happening to the Sikh farmers in Punjab, but also the other farmers in Punjab and in Haryana and all over the country as well. And not even just over the country. I mean, this is, I was reading into this a little bit, like thinking, okay, where do these bills come from? Because like you said, it happens in America, it happens all over the world. And there seems to be directives coming from a non-binding UN agreement on sustainable development. That this agreement was signed in 1992. It's non-binding, but voluntarily many companies and countries have signed up to it, countries especially actually. And basically the end game is to eradicate poverty by 2030. But in practice, it's very difficult to measure poverty, especially when you have to keep changing the definition of poverty because of inflation. So whether this is actually being delivered on or not, it's very difficult to tell at this point, but it does seem to be a worldwide kind of move to take control of the agriculture, the global agriculture systems.
And we're speaking here from the UK, and I think it was just yesterday that on my own personal social media, I reached out to a group, I think they're called Saving British Farms, because I saw them posting about their own issues. And I thought that, look, this is very, very similar to the issues that, the Sikh community and obviously all farmers across India are facing right now. And I said, perhaps you might want to kind of show some solidarity with this movement that's happening out there in India right now, because that will bring a lot more traction towards what you're saying and, the issues you're facing, which are very similar here in the UK. So, there's definitely a bigger pattern towards this issue that, it'd be great if for us to kind of get to the bottom of, but as people will see we've got a lot of topics to cover, so we don't always get that time. But moving back towards the kind of media image that we're seeing regarding the protesters, aside from the fact that they're portraying them as angry and violent, that of course links in with the fact that a lot of media are portraying them as portraying this as a kind of Khalistani movement, given that there's a lot of Sikhs behind it. Now, many have come out and spoken and said that I'm talking about protesters now. They've come out of their own accord and said this is not a push for Khalistan. You can see some ties in the fact that this is a demand for kind of more sovereignty, more rights for control of our own land. So you can see the kind of tie-in, but it's very fair of them to make that differentiation that this isn't a Khalistan movement. But sadly, that comes because the Indian state, their propaganda has basically conflated Khalistanism with being a terrorist to a kind of jihadi extent.
And it's the go-to slur, you know.
It is, yeah.
Anytime a Sikh wants to stand up for their own basic human rights, you know, to feed themselves without, you know, to feed the community without draconian measures from the Indian government, they're labeled as a Khalistani, as an extremist, as a separatist, as though they don't have love for the community.
That's the aim there, isn't it? To kind of turn others in the country against them, like saying, you know, they're not doing this for you, they're doing this for their own kind of, you know, faith-based agenda. I remember there was an old article which talked about kind of ethnic cleansing being a part of the Khalistani model. I think that came from Canada during the period where there was a lot of kind of Indian propaganda filtered into the Canadian media regarding coverage. So yeah, that's definitely a way that they are trying to turn the people against the protesters.
But essentially it's human rights, it's basic human rights. And this goes to, you know, whether it's beating elderly men in the street, whether it's, you know, imposing measures that cause farmers to commit suicide, whether it's the infiltration of the water supply, you know, the rerouting of water streams. And, you know, these are all human rights issues. You know, there's nothing controversial, nothing separatist about it until, you know, that's something separate. You know, that's a separate issue. But when it comes to the actual basic human rights, and this is the reason why people do get frustrated, and this is the reason why people do say, you know, if the government isn't looking out for us in India, then we need some sort of change. And we certainly, you know, can't continue to accept these kind of regulations.
And just, you know, want to touch one more point onto this kind of, you know, the Indian media using Khalistani as a slur. It puts people like us, the Sikh Press Association, in a very difficult position, because we have to kind of differentiate between the fact that a lot of the protesters are saying, you know, yes, of course, this is not a Khalistani movement, but at the same time, we are trying to take away the stigma from that very term as well. So, you know, that's something that I guess requires a lot more community discussion and longer term efforts to just kind of portray a realistic image of what Khalistan means to many within the Sikh community. But touching back onto kind of the media portrayal in India about the protesters right now, another thing that I've noticed, which is a standard go-to, is them simply saying, and it hasn't just been media figures, because today I also saw it was kind of some of these yogi type spiritual figures as well, claiming that the protesters are just uneducated and they just don't know what they're talking about. So that's why they are acting irrational and, you know, acting in a way which is just becoming of the uneducated.
Absolutely. And that's so far from the truth. I mean, the one thing, if you know, that nobody can deny is when it comes to farming, these are the most educated people arguably in the world. You know, these Punjabi farmers have history, like centuries of history of you know, maybe even more of millennia of history actually in farming, in agriculture. So for anybody outside of the Punjabi farming community to say that these guys don't know what they're talking about is very, you know, it's very inflammatory. It's very
just insulting, isn't it? Because it's just, how can you make out that these people are just so idiotic that they don't understand these laws, and therefore that's why they're acting this way? That you would see 12 million people take to the streets just from a lack of education and a lack of understanding about a law. I think it shows how flimsy these arguments against their position really are, because as you were saying earlier, they try these methods to turn the wider country against, and they work sadly, but they use these methods to turn the wider country against these kind of movements, because they know that the truth is these movements are for everybody. They are something which will benefit the average Indian en masse, instead as something that kind of, I know you've been talking to me about, there is evidence of kind of, higher level Indian elite figures, politicians, whatever we want to call them, profiting of this kind of industry.
Absolutely. I mean, we see it here in the UK. We see the government selling assets, particularly with the NHS, to their friends, companies that they've actually got stakes in themselves as well. And in India, that's really the fear, is that there are, one or two very large corporations owned by business tycoons, business magnates, that the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and also, the Punjab government as well, they're not blameless either. They've been profiteering from, big business undercutting the prices and doing these favorable kind of deals. And yeah, that's a real concern as well. People, they don't trust that the government is there to look out for them. But just going back to this idea of we mentioned Khalistan, but there's also the term that we use as well, Khalsa Raj. And the Khalsa Raj is really to like we said, serve. It's like to make sure that people have their basic human rights intact, that people are able to express their religious, because that's another thing in India as well.
Yeah, religious freedom, definitely.
Religious freedom, there's rape, there's so many things that are completely against the Sikh way, the Sikh mode of living. And for me, my concern is, we've mentioned the Punjab government being in on this as well. We mentioned the Indian government, and the kind of the organizations that we have in place to lead us aren't doing a good job of it. I really, who do we turn to at this kind of time? Are the SGPC going to step in for us? The Jatadar of the Akal Takht, what are we going to, 200, 300, 400 years ago, it would have been a very different story.
Definitely. And I can say, I know I've listened to at least 2 or 3 interviews where the SGPC have come under criticism from the protesters for whatever role they are playing, which at the minute, even having spent the last week spending a couple of hours probably every day reading through different news stories about this issue, I can't tell you what role they're playing in kind of supporting what is a largely a Sikh-led movement, or, at least to some extent a kind of Sikh issue, as we were explaining earlier. So there's definitely leadership issues within this, but I think in general, kind of, if there is a succinct message to pass on about this, is that the arguments against the protesters are just very flimsy when it comes from those that are kind of pushing Indian state propaganda. And the movement itself is based upon the farmers just trying to ensure that they are not going to be open to exploitation, which could very feasibly, very soon lead to mass bankruptcy and mass land just
land grabs
basically,
food shortages as well.
Food shortages. Actually, to be fair, I didn't even think of the food shortage aspect to this. So
so there's a lot. That's an ongoing story. I'm sure we'll be covering that as it progresses, and maybe even talking about it next time we
definitely will, because the latest as of this discussion we're having here today is that there was a meeting between representatives of the farmers and the Indian government, and that basically came to nothing. The Indian government asked for them to form a specific committee to address them with the situation, and the farmers' representatives said this is just a delay tactic. They've formed whichever kind of committee or panel they're going to, and here are our demands. You respond to them, and that's what we're still waiting for.
Yeah. But it's been a very, very busy week in the news. Not just
one of the busiest ever, honestly. In my times as Sikh Press Association press officer, I've been 5 years now. This is definitely one of the craziest, busiest weeks for news ever.
Yeah, I mean, it started off with this very, very emotionally provocative story. The young lad in Telford, a young Singh, who was in a video that went viral, and got a lot of media attention as well. But he was effectively, he was jumped, he was assaulted by 2 white students from his school, it looked like. It was outside of school, after school, maybe, a 2-on-1 fight. And the young Singh's, his hair came loose, his batka came off. But I mean, fair play to him. He carried on fighting.
Yeah, which
like,
is, what
very
we
proud of
definitely
the
want to
young lad.
see. We represent the Sikh community here, so we're not shy of saying that. Yeah, it was a really kind of emotive and in many ways hurtful video. There were many elders that shared it saying, this reminds me so much of things that I've gone through. Yeah, so I mean, that we received so many messages about this in different ways where people were just adamant, you need to do this, you need to do that, or can we do this, can we do that? Because it just really touched the hearts of so many. And media, again, they know this. They know that when they share such videos, they're going to get lots of views. So this was pretty much covered by all mainstream media as well.
Yeah. So the police are involved. They've taken statements. They're collecting evidence. They're treating it like a race hate crime.
Yep.
So that's something that we have struggled with previously, is actually getting kind of proper care taken of Sikh hate crime cases. There's been recently the APPG for Sikhs set up to actually monitor hate crime and Sikh hate crime and kind of mobilize against it. The school has also put out a statement saying that they're not going to wash their hands off this just because it happened off school premises. Let's see what happens with that. The family of the young lad involved don't want too much attention. So this is something that has happened. It's not an isolated incident. I think a lot of, like myself as well, a lot of young Singhs growing. I remember when I was in school, I used to get into fights, especially in primary school, and the truth of the matter is, if you fight back and if you stand up for yourself, then that's the best way forward. Then it goes away. If you, and this is something that we do really need to instill into our children. We're Sikhs, we're Khalsa. Martial arts is part of our heritage. Martial arts is part of our psyche, and we need to be able to defend ourselves. We need to be able to defend others, let alone just ourselves. But we need to be able to defend ourselves. And like I said, the young lad did really well. But I think in schools and in in Sikh families in general, we really need to promote that, martial arts and also just confidence, being able to,
And that's one of the things that has definitely come out of this, has been a mass kind of movement within the community to say, like, we need to really get back to our martial roots and ensure that our youth, and I guess that should count for everyone, are kind of trained in this way. I do want to add that this doesn't, that if that happens, and that is happening, great groups like Lions MMA, of course, are, doing great work to kind of ensure that as many youth as possible are getting trained in martial arts. It won't resolve the issue of kind of racism, and specifically anti-Sikh racism that we see. And it has been raised to me a few times that there's probably a lack of understanding within the UK, and I guess within kind of any nation where the Sikh diaspora is in, that wider communities don't understand how insulting it is when there's any sort of attack on the start. And that includes kind of, any mockery of it, as we saw in this video, the video that we're talking about, which we won't show, but there's two students laughing at the Singh's guest becoming unraveled. And I think that is also something that kind of we need to work on to further that understanding. And I know that there have been a lot of people that have also been working to kind of empower our own as well, to say, this is my guess and I'm proud of it. And that's, two very important kind of aspects of what's coming out about this bullying story.
Absolutely. A young Singh in the playground getting into a fight, there's always going to be the chance that your badka comes loose and and the stigma that's attached to it. Sometimes, especially for young, vulnerable children who are growing up in a society where it's very difficult to keep your gears. We don't want to add to the stigma. It's like, if your gears comes loose, don't worry about it, move forward. That's the kind of attitude we need to have. Become a bit thick-skinned. And like I said, I can't fault the Singh at all. But I think in our community, if we work towards that, and like yourself, I saw some of those initiatives to kind of reduce that stigma, and I support that. I think that's really good. Good to see.
And that does remind me, we probably have a few to share. So people that might be listening or watching this were being like, well, I shared something with you, why don't you share that? And we just have a lot on our plate all the time. Like I said, we had easily thousands of messages about this. And then on top of that, the Khalistan issue. So there are some initiatives about, the topics that we're touching on regarding bullying that we do want to push. And there have historically been some. For example, last year we helped the Sikh Yorkshire Alliance, I believe it was, push their Sikh bullying issue into the media and cover it with local news. So, we're always here for that, and hopefully the Sangat know, and we will definitely be working on that.
Great. And another big story as well, and this
Huge.
is becoming a recurring theme.
Yep.
Censorship of Sikh issues. Obviously, with the Khalistan rally, that's generated a lot of talk on social media, and there are some with a vested interest in actually clamping down that conversation and shutting down that conversation. So what we saw was the hashtag Sikh being blocked on Instagram. And this isn't the first time that's happened.
Nope.
In June earlier this year, when we were remembering the Operation Blue Star attack and the genocide of the Sikhs, we exactly the same thing. The Sikh hashtag got blocked in exactly the same way, it seems, as well. So this is bot accounts that are posting pornographic imagery onto Instagram using the hashtag Sikh, forcing Instagram to take down everything related to that hashtag.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on that, so it happened in June during I think it was June 3rd maybe. So during what we would call a Sikh Genocide Awareness Week, where twice a year there's weeks are taken out where Sikh orgs largely specifically focus on the issue of the Sikh genocide of 1984. And when it happened in June, I was part of a meeting that happened a few weeks later with mainly North American Sikh organizations, speaking to Facebook and Instagram, because they're both owned by the same company, run by the same people now. Senior execs from these organizations about the blocking. And what they said was that a perfect storm, that was the exact term they used, a perfect storm, a sequence of events happened to create this perfect storm, which led to the hashtag being banned. And essentially, as you said, we're under this bot attack, which they called malicious. They said this was done on purpose. It wasn't just happened to be some people accidentally using Sikh or just happened to use Sikh to try and get attention. They are posting pornographic images, and they're also reporting them and getting them reported en masse at a very kind of a very quick rate. They said that stemmed from Turkey in June, and it was picked up by the Facebook or the Instagram team, in Germany. And it just so happened, because it was during the beginning of lockdown, when there wasn't much staff working in offices anymore, that the person that picked it up, whether it was an individual or a team, I don't know, in Germany, they didn't know what Sikh meant, SIKH. They had no idea what that meant. So therefore, that ended up being blocked. And by the time it reached the main team in America, it was already blocked for X amount of hours or days, or, still we aren't very clear on that, and neither are they. But for it to happen again, are we meant to believe that the perfect storm happened again? So these are the questions that we need to ask. And, I can say that we do have pending talks with Facebook and Instagram seniors to happen again. And I'm not too confident about us getting a clear answer again, but the pattern is self-evident in that, we are basically being censored in a targeted manner.
Yeah. So Facebook also censored, I think it was censored several Sikh organizations and individuals.
Yeah, that was the start of November. Again during Sikh Genocide Month, Awareness Week. Sorry.
So you've got two companies that are part of the same parent company, who are both involved in censorship of Sikh issues, and it's not the first time they've done it. And this idea that a guy in Germany can't just Google Sikh and see that it's one of the largest religions in the world. They sound like very flimsy excuses. If you feel like, these social media companies, which are household names, it shouldn't be so easy for them to be compromised, for them to take down. They should be a bit more resilient towards these kind of attacks. And we've also seen that people have had their posts removed or accounts taken down because they were in violation of Indian law. And this is UK Sikh organizations, which are in violation of Indian law. And Facebook, Twitter, so these social media companies in general.
Twitter's included. They've done it as well.
Have been taking down people accounts
based on Indian law. And how are they upholding Indian law in countries like the UK and USA? And we would hope that our governments that would be something they would want to address. And this has been raised, for example, with the Freedom of Religion APPG here in the UK. So hopefully we'll kind of be able to create some more traction on having that addressed. But overall, it is quite shocking. And, not to make it too personal, but you yourself had a post shared, which to me was one of the most shocking because, you explained what that post was.
It had absolutely nothing to do with any kind of separatist movement or anything like that. It was about the history of how Nihang Singhs were involved in battles, basically from the time of, I think it was starting from the time of Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj through the Misl period, mainly up until Maharaja Ranjit Singh's empire. And it was a post just about, this many Shaheedis happened. And I think this was one of the kind of keywords that
Shaheed, right? Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Martyrdom. But I challenged that. I clicked the button that said, challenge this takedown. And the next day they replied saying, yeah, actually this post was fine. There was nothing wrong with it, and they reinstated everything. But it had nothing to do with even the November, the assassination of Indira Gandhi or anything that happened in '84, anything at all. It's just...
So we can see clearly that they're kind of indiscriminate in what is targeted for censorship in that way, because they are kind of similar posts which were, just Kirtan programs, posts about Kirtan programs, which might have been like a Shahidi Smagam or something. But again, very non-political, just the use of the term Shaheed. And, largely the focus, I would say, is around Khalistan and posts around Khalistan. And that is what is attempted to being censored. But in the push for that, there's collateral damage, a term often used. And they don't care what is in the way, that, any of these other posts are collateral damage, and they're just taking them down. And the really strange thing seems to be when, as you said, if you challenge it, if maybe I perceive it as some kind of Facebook or Instagram admin person is sitting there, it'll be flagged up to them, and they'll wonder, why is this being removed? Why is this being blocked? Because I know for a fact there are people within Sangat that have been censored, that have had those conversations with Facebook and Instagram, tech admin, whatever, tech support, whatever we want to call them. And they have said themselves that we are not exactly sure what has led to this being removed or banned, but, we'll reinstate it now.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's that use of Khalistan as kind of like the bogeyman.
Yeah.
To
justify these kind of,
Yeah. Just to put fear into the minds of the Hindu population, of the mainstream, population in India, that the Sikhs are, they have some sort of hate towards the general people.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. Any kind of hatred is only towards the injustice.
Yeah.
It's not even towards any individuals, like it's just towards the injustice. It's the unfair violations of basic human rights that, that is causing all of this. If the human rights were respected, and if it was a civilized society, then it would be very different. And this is what they're trying to avoid talking about, is the actual human rights abuses. They don't want to have that conversation.
Yeah.
They want to have a conversation about separatism, about Khalistan, but nobody's really talking about that. They're talking about their own human rights, talking about their own ability to feed their family. And this is really the real crux of the issue. And this is just a diversion tactic.
Definitely. And that comes back to kind of our role as a Sikh news agency, that, trying to remove the stigma of that narrative that's within the media, which is Indian propaganda media, which is very anti-Khalistan, and at the same time bringing it back to all the variety of issues that Sikhs are suffering with when it comes to that relationship with the Indian state, to highlight, why there is certain kind of beliefs or positions. And at the same time, we should have the right to talk about Sikh history, as you were with your Facebook post, without kind of any fear of being censored and having, your profile taken down or anything as such. So, a lot of work to do there.
Yeah. And I mean, specifically with the social media issue, these social media companies, they seem very compromised, and it doesn't feel like there's much of a future for Sikhs on these platforms. If we can't even talk about, our own family members, in some cases being killed by the, police who have actually been found guilty.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can't even talk about this on social media, then there's no freedom of speech there. And we really do need to, as a community, start thinking about, what steps can we take away from these major companies that are censoring us. And perhaps, what that might look like, I don't know, maybe a social network of our own, But these conversations do need to be had.
Yeah, I think we've done. That's we'll
Yeah.
call it. So first ever Sikh PA show.
Yeah. Thank you for watching.
Yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.
Waheguru ji ka khalsa, Waheguru ji ki fateh.